Hello, my name's Elijah Wells and today's review is Matt Gurtman's new movie, Fantastic Four: First Steps. Set in an alternative timeline where it's largely like 1960s retro-futuristic aesthetics, or more commonly being Earth 828. It follows the Fantastic Four as they're basically in their prime, as in it's been well established to the public that they are superhumans after a space acquisition 4 years earlier that essentially gave them those powers like being a rock or being invisible, being on fire, or just stretching a lot. But however, their sweet little time on Earth has slightly took a slightly different turn when the Silver Surfer turns up and says, "Well, your plan's marked for death, and Galactus is coming." And of course, the Fantastic Four and the entire world braces for impact for Galactus's awakening, and of course, Galactus's invasion of Earth. And speaking of four, this is the fourth iteration of the Fantastic Four on the big screen. We start off on 1994 when there was the famously unreleased movie, The Fantastic Four, which was produced by B-movie legend and indie legend Roger Corman. Of course, the film had somewhat of a strange cult following, not just with the recent honest trailers that came out about this movie and also clips of it surfacing around on YouTube, but also that it never officially came out, despite saying it were to come out in 1994. But however, due to rights issues and all that shenanigans, it never saw the light of day. But bootlegged copies have since surfaced around the internet and even on physical copies. Then in 2005, Tim Story, who is best known for his work with Barbershop, has later directed a movie, The Fantastic Four, and the sequel, Rise of the Silver Surfer, which came out 2 years later in 2007. The film had a much more of a laid-back approach and almost felt like a warmth and more comfortable take on the Marvel's First Family, but however it did end up with mediocre reviews, saying it was just tone-wise was felt more of a comedy than a superhero movie. And of course, Chris Evans, who plays in this movie, does play in the Marvel Cinematic Universe as none other than Captain America. Then in 2015, there was the very, very poorly received Fantastic Four movie by Josh Trank with Miles Teller and Jamie Bell, Kate Mara, and of course Michael B. Jordan. The film was mired in near constant studio interference and just really poor box office intakes and an even worse critical reception, so much so that its director Josh Trank disowned the movie publicly. And speaking of another Fantastic Four alumni that went to MCU, we have Michael B. Jordan, who was in Black Panther. Now we get to the point where the Fantastic Four are officially a part of the MCU lore at this point. Not just Richard Reeves, who was in Doctor Strange, being portrayed by Joseph Kosinski, but in this time they have their own little universe, being Earth 828, as in it takes place on an alternative timeline. However, this iteration is a lot different from the three previous iterations we have seen of Fantastic Four, as this movie is not an origin story at all. Like I said earlier, as in this is essentially takes place 4 years after the events of the incident that gave him these powers. So it's essentially at a point where the public's perception of these superheroes is pretty much as warmed up and cozied up to them. Essentially similar to the Superman movie, which only just came out like a few weeks ago. Which again, similar idea, as in it's basically about a superhero, not necessarily an origin. It's just 3 years into their superhero entree. And of course, the public perception about them. So, if you've seen two superhero movies about first of their respective rebooted franchise, and it's not necessarily an origin story, and of course the public's somewhat wavy attitude towards them after a really big instance that's beyond their control, so you can watch. Okay, they're both actually really good. Can we just go on with Fantastic Four then? Okay. And putting a 1960s aesthetic that's futuristic and retro at the same time is somewhat reminiscent to me, not just of the animated series that came out in 1967, but also something like the Hanna-Barbera series, The Jetsons, which again oddly reminiscent of these two series, as in they're both around the 1960s, and have a somewhat of a 60s like design work of the future, which is again something I found like really cool, and I think that Fantastic Four has probably borrowed some similarities between that and the Jetsons, so I wouldn't be surprised if there was any connotation about it, but I definitely did see some wink wink nod nod nudges about these things, but again, this is some really interesting stuff, particularly again, like I said, not just the design, like the production design is also really gorgeous to look at, which some instances does remind me of something like 2001 Space Odyssey, which is again a brilliant movie, particularly when they're in a space shuttle and they have to go in this other little space shuttle to essentially go into light speed, which I think some shots of it reminds me of that film particularly, again using 60s stuff. And also the costumey work is also very nice, and the hair stuff and the makeup also again somewhat reminiscent of the 1960s, which is again something I did find a lot of admiration and appreciation for. And I'm guessing the reason this takes place in like some 60s world is so it doesn't go in the main timeline. It's just because it could like overcomplicate or just adds more overload to the lore of the main timeline of the MCU with, that could very easily go into the trap of like just completely overcomplicating things. But they said in the alternate timeline being Earth 828, essentially in its own little universe, and we do actually see at the end of Thunderbolts of their little spaceship entering into the main timeline, even though spoiler alert, it doesn't go in that direction, as in they go into the main timeline of Earth. But again, I wish they could have gone into that conclusion as well for like post credit scenes, but we didn't, unfortunately. But again, this is some really interesting lore you can put into the alternate timeline without like completely cramming up the main timeline. The performances all around are really good. And we have Pedro Pascal, who is having the most extraordinarily busy summer this year. Not just this film, we have also Eddington and Materialist coming out this summer as well in the UK. Who's also essentially the leader of the Fantastic Four as Richard Reed. Again, basically being almost like the father type of everyone around, or essentially the leader type of all of them. And he does give off a very commanding presence, and there's also a massive subplot with him and Vanessa Kirby as Sue Storm having a little baby, which is and having it and giving birth in space, which is somewhat complicates things, but it does get justified, particularly in the third act of the movie, where it does make a lot more sense why it did happen, or really in halfway into the movie why it did happen due to Galactus. But we don't talk about spoilers unless necessary. Again, both give up some really good performance, particularly have a lot of on-screen chemistry. I can say that to the rest of the Fantastic Four heroes, particularly Elba Moss Baccarat, who plays the Thing in this movie. Well, here's the Thing. The Thing is actually has a lot of characteristics. Essentially, is the big brother type to Justice Quinn's character being Johnny Storm, who again have somewhat of a brotherly duo in this movie. As for Richard Reed as Sue Storm's almost father-mother type, again, really strong, really good chemistry, and also some really clever dynamics that they've flown in together. And also there's Ralph Fiennes, who plays Galactus in this movie. He is a very underrated actor in my opinion. He does appear in the later Harry Potter movies, and is also in this movie. He also does some gothic horror stuff like The Witch, Green Knight, Nosferatu, but he's more known for like his stuff on TV like The Office, Game of Thrones, and Chernobyl, and also video game stuff like Diablo, Assassin's Creed, and of course Final Fantasy. Like, very underrated person, and he is absolutely killing it as Galactus. Particularly, you do feel like he's oozing in the amount of threats, and his threats are somewhat really he does really bang him, bring him up, to a great degree. Like, you see what I did to these planets, I'm gonna do it to yours. And of course, how he does it, I could spare Earth as long as you give me the baby. As in some really intense and very thought-provoking stuff as the Fantastic Four attempt to do a bargain with him midway into the movie, and he basically flips a table on them, okay, I'll come to Earth and get the baby, and so I can end my prolonged suffering. And of course there's Julia Garner as Silver Surfer, who in the Tim Story versions, it was the voice work was done by Lawrence Fishburne, and the motion capture work was done by Dark Walker. Walker, who's known for like Hellboy and Pan's Labyrinth. Again, although she has somewhat of a relatively brief role in this movie, she does bring up a lot of intrigue about this movie, as she does a blessing in a foreign alien language that Johnny Storm, who I'm guessing is linguistic in this movie, even though it doesn't fully go into that depth, like why Johnny Storm has linguistic skills and how he tries to break down the language of it and try to feed it back to her. Essentially, Marvel's version of Arrival. And how the Fantastic Four use their powers, even in more mundane situations, is somewhat is definitely way better pulled off in this film than, let's say, the Tim Story era films. Like, I think in the original 2000 series, like they used their powers, like for example, Richard Reeves would like use his stretching arms to get his bag into like the overhead bag luggage you get in airplanes, or do some moves in the disco hall, and also do this with his hands. Like, I think kind of a little bit silly. And Johnny Storm would just go into X Games and pretty much everyone's and of course Sue Storm is just there to get nude for some reason, even though it's kind of a little bit weird. And Ben Grimm is just there to be essentially a glorified statue at this point. I think in the Josh Trank version, when they use their powers for mundane situation, they only just use it for practice and barely even use it for that final battle scene. To the point they don't really use it in more suburban, more basically more mundane situations. But in this film, it does get a lot more we'll just say it does get used quite in a more prevalent role. Like Reed Richards would do math equations on chalkboard and would just stretch his arm more and more and more as he goes into further down the chalkboard. And there's also Sue Storm, who, after a little bit of a heated argument about what to do with Galactus, after just shouting at him, he just disappears. Like, not just disappear, like I'm going to bed. He just disappears like boop. So basically like that. And also Ben Grimm, who meets up with a bunch of kids at a nearby elementary school and points to a car like, you want me to throw this car? And he like, oh no. And he lifts it up like, maybe I can throw it to you. Woo, woo, woo. Bob puts the car down because I'm guessing the owner of the car might be having to deal with a lot of insurance paperwork, depending how it works in the 1960s. And of course, there's Johnny Storm, who uses his flaming hand during a blackout sequence in the movie, and basically does some linguistics breakdown, like, okay, and doing that somehow without even burning paper, which, again, very cool stuff. I think the major critique I have about this movie, even though I had somewhat of a pretty hard time finding something to criticize the movie about, because it was definitely a feel-good film, in my opinion, but I feel like there was definitely something that drew it back. But the more I thought about it, I think there was definitely a couple of glaring issues I had personally with the third act. Yeah, I know the action's like pretty cool in that scene and all that, but I feel like the third act was kind of like a lot more crudely put together. It wasn't the best put together like sequence, in my opinion, like whatever has Marvel's done. Not particularly it was like a poorly executed third act, but I feel like it wasn't the best executed third act. I felt like it was just kind of somewhat a bit tied together, like, okay, let's do this and do that. And I feel like some of the planning of Richard Reed's in that film, in that third act, was starting to come into like the more convoluted area, as in I feel like it just crammed in one too many ideas and one too many plan Bs that I feel like, okay, I feel like you're just kind of overcomplicating things at this point. Even though there are definitely some moments in the third act which I do not want to get into because spoilers. But I feel like it was kind of like somewhat hastily put together. But I think at the end, after they quickly walk out of a talk show, not out of frustration, but there was an emergency, and they have to put a baby seat on at the car, and they're all trying to argue, and they're all like arguing each other, like, okay, you have to put the seatbelt through the baby seat, not under it, and you have to put it through the slits and all that. It was basically the old like comics idea of like watching like three apes trying to put on a light bulb. I think it was from like Family Guy or something, where Peter made like no, like three monkeys to essentially put on a light bulb, which is again a really funny concept. Again with humans that are trying to put a baby seat in their car or their flying car. Although there are one or two glaring issues I definitely did have with Fantastic Four, but however the film was fantastic nonetheless. The action scenes for most part are really well done, and the acting of Pedro Pascal, Vanessa Kirby, Ebon Moss-Bachrach, and Joseph Quinn in this movie are also really good in this movie. The villains in this movie are complete top notch, and how the movie really incorporated the 1960s aesthetics of this movie with a lot more of a futuristic vibe coming out of it. Essentially, again, like I said earlier, more of akin to something like the Jetsons, which is again a really great way to homage the series, and also the 1960s animated series of Fantastic Four, which came out in the 60s. And of course, everything about this movie almost came together, even though I did nitpick quite a bit from something like the third act movie, which I feel like, in my opinion, didn't exactly come together the most cohesively, in my opinion. But I feel like this is definitely one of the better entries into Marvel's category post-COVID, given how really inconsistent they are in quality, and it's definitely got me a little bit more excited with the upcoming new films like Doomsday and Secret Wars. So for Fantastic Four First Steps, I'm feeling a 7 out of 10 on this one. So, what do you think of Fantastic Four First Steps? Let me know in the comments down below, like this video, subscribe to this channel, and also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, Blue Sky and Threads. This is Elijah Wells, and bye.